I have a client, they're a lawyer, he really wants to hire.
I can't work at all.
Let's say it's anything over 300.
I've done private work in Monroe.
Oh, really?
Good evening, meeting is called to order. Welcome everyone, please stand for the flag salute.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Patricia Duran. Here. Robert Brown.
Here.
Pamela Renee. Here. Robert Reynolds. Frank Reynolds.
Here.
John Scott.
Here.
Michelle McWigan. Here. Laurie Cross. Craig Morgan.
Here.
Ron Biggs. John Albana. Aaron McGrath. Here. Okay, this meeting is held pursuant to the provisions of the Open Public Meetings Law and annual list of meetings. Edition, a copy of the notice is and has been available to the public and is on file in the office of the municipal clerk. We have minutes from July 9th,
Madam Chair, I'll offer a motion to approve the minutes of July 9th.
offered by Randy House,
I'll second that motion.
second by John Ansella. Roll call. Patricia Duran? Yes. Robert Brown? Pamela Renee?
Yes.
Robert Reynolds?
Yes.
Randy Reynolds?
Yes.
John Scott?
Yes.
Michelle McWigan? Yes. Frank Morgan?
Yes.
Aaron McGrath? Okay, we only have one thing on the agenda this evening, and that's the discussion.
I'd actually like to make a motion to postpone the discussion since it's a Jewish holiday and our borough planner can't be here to take questions. I'd like to make that motion.
Well, I don't think we're gonna make any decisions today, so I think that's probably, I think the best way, not to cut you off, is that I don't think since we just got this, I think might be appropriate, is we have our planner here, the board's planner, for her at least to explain to the board how the process goes, and I don't think the board really at this point, from what I've seen, is ready to act on this. So it may be prudent to at least have the discussion, probably hold up any formal action, because I think there still needs to be some discussion in it. Then at the next meeting, the borough's plan to come in, since we won't have the holiday, and add any follow-up questions, then we can make a formal action. Okay, would that be better?
Yes,
Okay, you withdraw your motion?
I withdraw my motion.
Perfect.
Was that scheduled at all or anything, that the borough planner be here for this particular meeting?
To my knowledge, it has.
Okay.
I was just curious. I wasn't contacted by anyone from our paper associates. I don't know if the board secretary was.
No.
All right, so,
Can we make a motion?
resolution from the municipality. I think the best thing is, asking us to look into what they call an area in need of rehabilitation, which is different than the area in need of, redevelopment, okay? Those are fun legal terms, okay? They have certain meanings. I think it's probably best, since I don't think this board has dealt with that, at least from my time here, that we could have our, Jennifer Bean, who's, our land use planner with, the Vakian's office, at least explain to the board the process, what goes back, what needs to be done and everything else, so we have some context to the request. And I think, and then what Jennifer says, the board could ask her any questions, then we could, go from there.
All right, so I'll actually make a motion that we have the land use board planner review the process and this information that was given to the land use board, and the effects and what it really is about and how it will affect Neptune City negatively, positively, and review that and give this board a professional opinion at our next meeting, and possibly a budget, or a quote on what it would cost for a Vakian,
Sure.
to do that. So that, I'll put that motion out.
Well, I think, Mr. Mayor, it's a great motion, but we hold that motion until Jennifer at least tells us how the process works. I think that'd probably be better.
Sure.
I think that'd be a better way to then,
I mean, the global process you're talking about, not like,
in general,
sure.
without being fact specific, because no one's done the investigation.
So I know that the borough, by the way, for those who don't know me, I'm Jen Beam. I'm the planner for Vakian's office, and I guess was appointed by the board in January as the land use board planner. So I know that the borough has gone through redevelopment initiatives in the past. This is a little bit of a different animal in that a rehab designation, and from my understanding, the proposal, I guess, was to do a borough-wide investigation to declare the borough in its entirety as an area in need of rehabilitation. That's a little different than a redevelopment designation. And the word redevelopment is utilized in both of these processes, so it does get a little confusing, cumbersome, but what I will say is, in a traditional redevelopment designation, you would have to make a finding of blight, for lack of a better word. And that would be adopted through the governing body through the same process as an ordinance would be adopted, where you have first reading, it would come to this board for an evaluation, then go back to the governing body for a public hearing. Once that designation is prepared, a redevelopment plan, again adopted in a similar fashion to an ordinance, would be enacted, whether it be in the area in its entirety or in specific areas.
And that would be, sorry to cut you off, and that would be generally directed to a specific piece of property or multiple pieces of property.
Typically that's an area, maybe it's one large tract, or it's multiple lots in a specific area. It's very atypical for a municipality in its entirety to be deemed in need of redevelopment. Here, in a rehab designation, the burden is lower in terms of the criteria that is required to be met, and it's a little bit more straightforward. There's 6, I saw that all of you guys got a copy of this proposal that I guess went out a couple days ago, and on page 3, there's a summary of the 6 items that would enable a community to designate an area of municipality's entirety, individual lots, or what have you, in need of rehabilitation. There's 6 items. The first is a significant portion of the structures are deteriorated or substandard. 2, more than half the housing stock is 50 years old or older. 3, there's a pattern of vacancy or abandonment. 4, there's a consistent process, or there's a consistent circumstance within the community of properties in tax arrears, whether there's contamination on the property, or whether or not the infrastructure is old and substandard. So to evaluate this process to see whether or not the borough would qualify under one or more, and you technically only have to qualify under one of those 6 criteria in order to be designated in need of rehabilitation. I will say, though, that there does need to be an end game, an end plan. So if, for example, the housing stock within the borough is 50 years old or older, which is a pretty straightforward fact to check, if the goal at the end of this process has nothing to do with residential redevelopment, you can't designate the borough based on the age of the housing stock. There has to be a correlation between the designation and what the end plan is for a community. The difference between redevelopment and rehab is very simple. First and foremost, the governing body adopts it by resolution. So while people may be able to comment on it at the public portion of a public meeting, it's adopted by resolution. There's no ordinance, there's no technical public hearing that's required, and it's very straightforward. You meet the criteria or you don't, it's adopted by resolution. Rehab designations do not allow for the use of eminent domain at all. It's illegal. So if there is a designation of rehab, whether it's borough-wide or a specific portion of the borough, no development initiative that would utilize that designation can use eminent domain, period. It's not even something that can be discussed. Secondly, in a traditional redevelopment area, the community, the municipality that undergoes the process has the ability to offer tax abatements up to 30 years for investment and what have you in a redevelopment area. Under rehab designation, that time is cut to 5 years. So it doesn't allow for long-term redevelopment area bonds or tax abatements to the 30-year period that a traditional redevelopment initiative would allow. It's cut off at 5 years. So, you know, it's difficult to ascertain whether or not the process is appropriate, given the fact that I really have not been obviously in the loop on the process here, but also I don't know what the end goal is. So what are we trying to accomplish with the designation? Because that is critically important to if the community as a whole or a portion of the community even qualifies this process. So that's obviously something that would have to be investigated. Is this an initiative that the community is interested in undertaking, yes or no? The answer is no, then the process stops. If the answer is yes, then what's the goal at the end of the day? Like what plan is in place that would be furthered by the designation? And then from that end, whether or not the community as a whole or in part would qualify under that piece of the statute that would help facilitate that goal. So those are things that would have to be investigated moving forward. But the process is much simpler than a traditional redevelopment designation because the criteria is very cut and dry, whereas a blight designation or underutilization designation is a little bit more subjective. And the case law over the years has made it very difficult if properties are not in, you know, conditions that would be obviously blighted or underutilized. You know, the case law recently has made that designation more difficult. This is an easier process, but you know there are limitations to what you can and cannot do with that designation moving forward.
Can I ask you a question? On this 50-year-old delineated area, homes at least 50 years old. Now, if you have a home that's built in 1930, but you've completely renovated it, it's got a new kitchen, it's got new additions, new everything, is that still considered 50 years old?
So that, yes, the answer is yes, but that's kind of why I was saying that I need to understand what the end game is. Because if the end game doesn't involve some kind of residential rehabilitation or development,
Right.
then, and the goal is geared more towards commercial, development or redevelopment, then that component I would not advise because there have been instances where, yep, this is an older community. I'm very sure that more than 50% of your housing stock in the community as a whole are more than 50 years old.
Right.
But if the end goal has no residential investment rehabilitation, then that designation is not gonna stand up should somebody challenge the
Right.
process moving
Perfect
forward.
examples down the street from me, you know, that Marty and Linda bought that house, that was from, I'm forgetting the guy's name now, but on the water there. They raised, the thing is worth like $2 $1 million now, it's gorgeous.
Right, but it's over 50
But,
years
oh,
old.
it's old as heck, yeah.
Have you seen my 90-year-old home?
I have it.
And so that the plan is, when they talk about the plan, Jennifer, it's a plan, all right, you determine that, yeah, you're 50% over 50 years. The plan is how to stop that further deterioration. There's no plan for it.
The second one, the designation really
Well, that's the
shouldn't
whole thing in
apply.
a town like ours, the plan is that most people come in and, I mean, look what they're doing in that house on West Sylvania, those guys bought that house and it is budding right now. I mean, who buys an old house nowadays in 2019 and doesn't rehab it themselves? Nobody. Nobody just moves into a dump and stays there. If you're gonna spend that kind of money nowadays, you were already planning on doing something.
You still do that
You-
in Neptune City.
Thanks, Sean.
And you had said 50%. You had said 50% here. I would say it's more 75 or over.
I would not disagree, but again, like without having the benefit of what the ultimate goal is at the end of this process, it's difficult to determine whether the balance of the criteria, so that goes back to the first criteria, which is a significant portion of the structures are substandard or deteriorated condition. So just because they're old doesn't mean they're substandard or deteriorated. So it's important when you go through an initiative as a community to understand what the goal is, to make sure that the designation, and I know there's a piece of property on Third and Union that's a warehouse or whatever that's vacant and probably could use some love, that property, but saying that your housing stock is 50%, 50 years or older,
To get
doesn't
that one.
facilitate a redevelopment initiative that doesn't include some kind of residential component to it.
Bryn?
And if I could ask another board member, you make the motion for this. What is your end goal of this?
Thank you for asking. It's definitely not to bulldoze anybody's house, that's for sure. It is for commercial development.
Can you speak a little bit louder for the
It's
audience?
definitely for commercial redevelopment of, like you said, at Third and Union. We have old East Coast Ice that's vacant, property that the borough, has acquired, certain things like that. There's some environmental issues that we would like, to be taken a look at, that, we have some flooding issues that we would like to be taken a look at, and all through plans that we can, possibly get grants for, that we can only get grants for at the state and federal level if we have a plan. So that's the reason for the plan, so that we get grants instead of raising taxes.
I'm just curious what program you're talking about that would offer grants, because I mean, I'd be interested beyond here, considering, you know, money is super tight these days, and a redevelopment designation itself does not open you up to money being available.
Exactly, but we have a unique opportunity here because the state has declared our town an opportunity zone, and so there are grants available at the federal level currently.
Well, actually, I mean, I don't mean to cut you off, but the opportunity zone has absolutely nothing to do with the redevelopment designation, whether it's rehab or redevelopment. Opportunity zone is a federal program that encourages private investment into areas that have been identified as opportunity zones to allow them to get relief for capital gains tax. It's not a local, it's not a state issue, it's a federal issue. And whether an area is designated as needed rehab or redevelopment has no impact on an opportunity zone. It's a separate and apart, that's a federal program where the idea is that if you were to sell an asset where you would have capital gains, where you would typically have to pay taxes on capital gains, if you reinvested those capital gains into an area that is identified as an opportunity zone, and that investment stayed in that area for over 7 years, there's a reduction in the obligation to pay on the capital gains. If it stays in 10 years plus, the reduction is increased. But it's more of it's an incentive for private investment, it's not an incentive for public investment.
Right, but it does, having a rehabilitation plan allows us to advertise, for developers, otherwise we wouldn't be able to do so because they are private properties. So it would enable us to be able to advertise. It would also enable us to be able to develop public partnerships, and also to negotiate with developers to pay back the portion of the plan that, we're spending the money on. Otherwise we wouldn't be able to legally, negotiate with developers unless we have a plan. That's part of it too. And also, there are grants available at the federal level, that you can only apply for if you have a plan.
say have a plan,
Rehabilitation plan.
okay, so if there's such thing as a rehabilitation plan, there's a rehabilitation designation from which individual redevelopment plans are prepared. So if you designate an area in need of rehabilitation, the next step after that designation is to identify areas and prepare a redevelopment plan. So, I mean, I've been doing this for almost 30 years, and that's a process that I'm gonna obviously have to look into, because that is not my understanding, and I've gone through this. I mean, I work for Neptune Township right next door, and they also are an opportunity zone, and they have identified redevelopment areas, not rehab designated redevelopment areas, but redevelopment designated redevelopment areas. And I mean, we've been working with developers in those areas for the past several years, and I'm definitely gonna look into it, because it opens my eyes that there's opportunities that maybe the township is not looking into. But my understanding is that a rehab designation would then require the next steps to be a redevelopment plan preparation on a specific piece of property. However, because it's a rehab designation, the property owner has to buy into the process, because you cannot take the property. You have to have individual property owner buy-in in order to initiate conversations that would enable a private transaction. But I don't really see that there's any impediment to advertising that the borough has an opportunity zone designation. That, I mean, that you put on your website, that's perfectly legitimate. You know, Neptune has it on their website that there are specific areas in the Midtown that are identified as opportunity
People have to
zones,
buy into it.
but it's private investment, so they really stay out of
We
it.
could be looking out this money and not see anything at all.
Could you speak a little bit
Could I talk a little bit about this? So, we have done, a couple, first of all, the rehabilitation, and just my opinion, I've been part of a couple of redevelopment plans. As this board has been, a part of a lot of what's going on here in Neptune City for, the past several years. I commend you for your time. And we've successfully, done a couple of redevelopment plans, projects, in conjunction with the owners of the property. And that alone takes 5 years, and it is a lot of money on both sides. I know it's not all reimbursable by the developer, not every penny.
Plan prep, the study prep is definitely not, that's owned by
So,
the community,
and
but
that
the
can-
plan prep, once they're designated as a developer, can be reimbursed
Right.
to the town, to the
So-
community, yes.
There are areas, there's always areas, every town has certain areas that are in need of redevelopment. And that's a tough way to go, redevelopment. If you are not working with the property owner, it can be very expensive, and it can take a long time, and have nothing at the end of the day. My concern with this whole rehabilitation thing is, to be quite frank, I mean, it's really just the first step into designating redevelopment zones. That's really all this is. It's a way to designate different areas in our town as redevelopment. And I know, I hear, oh, we're not gonna do condemnation, no intimate domain, but you know what? If you go back in the records, and you guys have been around, you've been doing this 30 years, it was the same story in Asbury Park, it was the same story in Long Branch, it's always the same story. And maybe people have good intentions, but when you're going and you wanna make this happen, and you have a property owner who says, I really like my business, I really don't wanna have a big fancy building here that I can afford and, raise my taxes, and I really don't wanna do that, I wanna just operate my business. Well, you can take their property, under redevelopment, this is the first step of rehabilitation it's like a soft step into designating redevelopment.
Well, the difference is, the short answer is, that if you prepare a redevelopment plan under a rehab designation, you cannot use eminent domain, that's illegal. If you do it through a redevelopment designation, which is the blight designation that I talked about earlier, you can, you have to now, as you're doing the designation, identify whether there's a plan to utilize it, or you have the option to utilize eminent domain or not. You have to do that up front when you do the study. Years ago, you did not have to do that. The option was always there. So when you went through the blight study, you could say no, but if the opportunity required it, there's a story about a redevelopment initiative in Atlantic City where this little old lady refused to sell her house, and a casino was kind of built over her house because they refused to take her property. I hate to say this because it's not politically popular, but there are instances where, under certain circumstances, the opportunity or the option to utilize eminent domain to further a large-scale redevelopment initiative may or may not be appropriate. However, it's become very unpopular, given the current case law that's taken place out of Long Branch in particular and Paulsboro down in South Jersey. So the law has changed from what it once was to now. If you go through that specific redevelopment designation, which is not what this is, you have to clearly identify upfront and censor whether you plan to utilize it or not. If you say no, you cannot use it. If you say yes, then it's an option. Yeah, you may use it, you may not. I will say that depending on the area that you're talking about, when you have a lot of properties that are owned by individuals, like a number of individuals, getting private investment to accumulate 10 or 15 properties in a block individually, and you have that one holdout that's going to hold up the whole thing, that's when you kind of have to question whether or not it's the right path. But in this particular instance, under a rehab designation, it's not even a question. You cannot do it, which means then at the end of the day, whatever redevelopment initiative comes from a designation like this, the property owner has to buy in. Because if they say, no, thank you, there's really nothing you can do about it. Right.
My concern is we're spending a lot of potentially money and time doing this. It sounds like that the idea was, let's identify commercial sites to start the process. But the process looks at the residential
Well,
properties.
that's one of 6 components that can get you to that designation.
But
So
the request is for, hey, the whole entire Neptune City
Right.
be designated. And it's almost like a couple of my friends goes, shoot, ready, aim. You just say you're gonna do it to try to figure out how to, you already got bullets already out of the chambers. Is that if it's really for commercial sites, why are we spending so time and money looking at the residential component of the town and competing that? I think that's what you need to look at. We look at
Right,
the game
that's
plan
kind of
is-
something I'm gonna have to take a look at.
is if the municipality says, well, I really only meant these commercial lots on Sylvania, or whatever street I'm talking about.
Right.
So that's a completely different story than looking at the housing stock of your house, and saying, you live in a neighborhood that's in rehabilitation, and you put that on your market when you try to sell your house.
That's always an issue.
Right, can I ask a question, Jen, real quick? So, in trying to clarify, because we've done the redevelopments, but the rehab is different, so in trying to clarify that, can you speak to maybe someone that has done this process before, and in that, what are the benefits to the current property owners, and what are the negative connotations? Because I would think that being a designated rehabilitation town would have some negative connotations for people that don't need to be rehabilitated. So
So
are
there
there
definitely
negative
is a-
connotations, and what would be a benefit versus just doing what we've always done, which is a redevelopment section by section?
Okay, so this is kind of a complicated question, so I'm going to take it step by step. So there has been in many communities that perception that being designated in need of rehabilitation is a negative thing, right? So for example, we tried to do this in the Bradley Park section of Neptune Township, and the residents came out opposed to it because they didn't want their homes branded as being in need of rehabilitation. And in spite of the fact that we explained that it's really not saying your house is a dump, it's really just in effect the governing body there. I don't even think it got to the governing body. I think it got squashed by administration when there was pushback in terms of the residents were just very unhappy. A community that has utilized this process very effectively is Woodbridge. Now, Woodbridge I don't equate to Neptune City. It's in Middlesex County. It's obviously much larger, more urban in character, but they have done a borough-wide rehab designation. And then what they have done in specific locations, let's say in a specific area, they've taken an intersection, like a strategic intersection in that community, and done a redevelopment plan for like those 4 lots or 6 lots that come to that intersection. And then the question becomes, when you get to the redevelopment plan portion of this, because that's why I said this redevelopment word is going to be used a lot. So it's a rehab designation on top of which a redevelopment plan is prepared. That plan is decided by the governing body whether it's an overlay zone or it's a superseding zoning. So you decide at the governing body level. So we are in the process of talking about this, for example, in Bradley, right, for Main Street. So now the sewer and the water in Bradley along Main Street is in bad shape, okay, and it's older. So I know that the borough does have a program in place strategically, incrementally to upgrade their infrastructure. But as it currently stands, the infrastructure on Main Street from municipal boundary to municipal boundary meets the criteria. They haven't acted on anything yet, but in that particular instance, the designation would be for the entirety of Main Street. And then let's just take the bowling alley as an example, right? So that bowling alley could use a little love. So, and that's a larger lot in that area. The intention is, if this kind of moves off the dime, which I don't know that it will, is that a redevelopment plan for that property will be prepared as an overlay. So the benefit to the property owner is you have the underlying zoning, which allows for XYZ plus additional development opportunities. However, if the property owner says, I am not interested, there's nothing that anyone can do about it, right? It's like any property that's owned currently within the community where you have zoning over top of it and people choose to, you know, upgrade their property or not, that's their call. So from an opportunity standpoint, it could provide in specific locations additional development opportunities for property owners should they want to do something with their property. And a redevelopment process gives more control to the governing body. You know, in large communities like Hoboken, Jersey City, they have an actual redevelopment agency. Communities like this, it doesn't really make a lot of sense because it's such a small community that you guys probably would be the same people anyway. So, but you can dictate from a community standpoint, you know, ownership versus rental, which you can't do in traditional zoning. You can dictate architecture, you can dictate where buildings go, what type of uses go where. It gives a lot of control over how the development lays out. So that could be a benefit to the community if a property owner is interested in working with the community to come up with a plan. But I'm not gonna lie, while it has worked in certain communities, there are others that shy away from it because of the potential stigma, and I have absolutely no inherent data on whether or not it is a fact or not, but just generally people take pride in where they live for the most part, and when you say that your house is in need of rehabilitation, people generally take that in a negative way. Do I think that that inherently decreases your property value? I have no information on whether that's true or not. But that is a perception that would have to be overcome, which is why I think just blanketly doing it borough-wide may become problematic because there are those, like you said, that have taken the time and finances to improve their properties on their own and probably wouldn't be too thrilled with you saying, or me saying, your property needs to be rehabbed. So it may be more appropriate in strategic locations in the borough, or not at all. But it's definitely something that I would, you know, as the mayor suggested, that, you know, I'd be happy to look into if the board would like me to. But there's a lot of layers to this, and it's definitely something that needs to be taken, it needs to be evaluated seriously. Because like you, I spend time, energy, money to make my house what I want of it, and maybe I don't like my neighbor's hideous teal siding, but they seem to like it, so it's their house. But you know, there's that type of issue that you kind of have to overcome. So you got to be careful in how you lay this out, because to just do it in like one fell swoop, it may have negative secondary impacts that are not anticipated.
So would now be a good time for me to make that motion?
I mean, I would ask Greg.
Yeah,
Greg's in charge.
No,
I'm
Make
just
a motion to have the
informational.
land board planner review this process and be able to come back to us with how it really would affect Neptune City. And I know you've touched a couple different towns, but, you know, I, no disrespect to Woodbridge or even Bradley Beach,
Right.
so they're a friendly neighbor. My concern is Neptune City. As
Understood, which is
member
why I
on
think
this
it needs
board.
to be evaluated.
And I, you know, before we
Individually.
move forward with this big paintbrush, you know, come back with us, with, you know, so that's the motion. And also a quote on what that
Sure.
might cost us.
So that kind of brings me to my question, was this ARH Associates, where did they come from? Is that someone we dealt with in the past?
There's a borough.
They were appointed in February.
I have a legal question about that, because the council was already directed ARH to do this study, so I'm not exactly sure how that stands legally.
We are doing the investigation. We hired the professional. That's it. You've asked us, the council has asked us to conduct an investigation. We hire the professional that helps us with the investigation. So while the municipality says, hey, hire this person for $18,100, we, or the board, just like you hire me, just like you hire Leon Vakian, we hire the professional to assist us with this investigation and this report. That's our obligation. And that's why I suggested at the beginning, since he's not here, that he come to the next meeting, because I didn't anticipate, because I kind of foresee all these questions, that at this point, we're not making a determination as to who the land use board is going to retain. I think there's a two-step process that Jennifer was going to bring up. One is the overall picture of impacts, and two, a proposal from our planner as to the cost as well.
Just as a comparison,
Yeah, right. You know, just as a normal practice, but it is art at the end of the day. Theoretically, Leon Vakian comes in at, I'll take ridiculous, $100,000. Yeah, we have the right to say we want $100. That's our professional. I'm not saying that's going to be. I'm taking a ridiculous example, which is the main point. But that's something you guys would make the decision. You know, I can pay $100,000. That might get for 18. But it's a determination of not only cost, qualifications, and everything else, but that's something we're going to discuss at the next meeting, because that planners are here. Jennifer is going to provide us their proposal. Then we can make that formal decision. But to answer your initial question, simply, it is our investigation. We get talking about it.
And it's not something that, this is not something that we should be rushing into. It really every member of this board needs to do their homework, and they need to be completely informed and have all the facts and be able to make their own opinion, based on, you know, we have faith in Jen Beam as this board's planner. And like I said, you know, this board has been through. They actually have been through a couple redevelopments, and they've done a great job, and it's been great benefits to Neptune City. You know, I know many years ago, a very bad redevelopment, it turned out to be bad, and I know some of the laws have changed now. You know, there was a lot of money spent, a lot of feelings hurt, a lot of businesses upset, and at the end of the day, there was nothing. And I don't know if that was because it was rushed into. I really didn't have a lot to do with it, but I know it. You know, it laid on the borough for years. So you have to be very careful when you do this. When you start redevelopment, you know, it may seem great that we want to go do these things. There's a lot to be considered, and that's why I put that motion on the floor.
It is a lot simpler when you're saying redevelopment this piece of property, because we all probably drove by it. Yeah, you drove by and like, yeah, that needs something done, but we're talking in request to do the higher. So to answer the original question, Mr. Mayor, yes, I think we've hit a lot of little questions that really need to be vetted, and then come back to the board. I'll reach out to ARH to tell them to come to the next meeting at 7 o'clock. Been in contact, appreciate for contacting me at least, but I will tell them to come back next meeting. Then we can have the twofold conversation. One, this question about whether this rehab is really something that has anything to do with federal grants and overall impact. And then two, if we get through all that process, okay, let's hire the professional to start that process or not start that process. Or or maybe during that process, the field goes from the city of Neptune, city, or
Do like a
Neptune
block or
City,
two.
to this area. You know, instead of shoot, fire, aim, to, okay, now this is what we want to look at.
He's backhanding
I got
it.
this email yesterday, so this is the first time I read it, was yesterday. I read this whole proposal. How could we ever make a decision on something like this? Well, I never even heard about it.
No, and I think that's the kind of purpose of this meeting,
Yeah.
so we didn't just carry it, let's
Right.
vet out a lot of the
Yeah,
questions.
because there's a million for it.
Right.
So we now have a motion on the table from Mayor Brown, to have our planner look into this further and come back. At the next meeting, do we have someone a second? We have a second by Randy Reynolds. Roll call, please.
Tricia Grant,
Yes.
Robert Brown,
Yes.
Pamela Renee.
I'm just gonna say, I'm not sure about the legality of it, but, so I'm just gonna fix the thing.
Robert Reynolds,
Yes.
Randy Reynolds.
Yes.
John Scott.
Yes.
Michelle McGuigan.
Yes.
Greg Morgan. Aaron McGrath. Yes.
You got some.
So what's the date of the next meeting? The 12th, is it the
Second.
12th of November?
The second Tuesday,
November 12th.
November
November
12th.
12th, okay.
Jen, have you ever seen anybody return the game?
What?
Have you ever seen anybody return the game?
Yes, but I think that so for example, Woodbridge has utilized this process very, very effectively, but I do agree that it's a different animal than Neptune City. It's a much bigger
But
community
I
with
felt like
individual.
I haven't seen anybody with any.
No, but I think as you get further down, Middlesex County is a different animal in its entirety, but as you get farther into like suburban, Monmouth County, I find that the process has been more effective and targeted, but it's not to say it's a small enough community and it may meet the criteria, under a different scenario if the end game is commercial redevelopment. So, I think it's important at the end of the day to understand what the goal, what the actual goal will look like, what the vision will be. Not just, that we wanna kind of go this direction, but, we have 6 blocks that we want to be mixed use, walkable, whatever, there needs to be a plan in order to pick the criteria to meet the designation that will stand up should somebody challenge it moving forward.
Well, we did the redevelopment that, second, I've been on board 10, 12 years or whatever it is now. And I was a little shocked when I saw this because I think we've been moving so positively in the town from, the initial getting rid of the Charlene Motel, the building Rondo, this is what I'm saying, right? And now, we just approved the 73 condominium complex, blah, blah, blah. I don't know, it just
The
seems
reason why
crazy.
it was, to approve the rehabilitation study instead of redevelopment is so that we can take a look at some of the flash flooding issues and a lot of the environmental issues that are town.
Can I ask you a question? You had, when you came up with this, you were throwing out information. Where's documentation on any of this, Steve? You have documentation that these grants are available and this, where are you getting your information from?
They're actually all over the website.
Well, have you produced anything for the board so we would know
I'll
what
be
you're
glad to do
talking
that
about?
next time, if you'd like. I'll be glad to bring that to next time.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, it's definitely to look at, flash flooding issues and the crumbling infrastructure, some of the big issues.
Well, we do not have crumbling infrastructure in Neptune City. So listen, you need to stop. Okay. Now, there is no crumbling infrastructure in Neptune City. You said that before, or we had Neptune City has all these environmental issues. Neptune City doesn't have environmental issues. Are there environmental issues in Neptune City? Absolutely. Just like every other town in the state of New Jersey, if there was a gas station in your town in the 60s, in the 70s, there's environmental issues. But they're not Neptune City's environmental issues. And as far as the crumbling infrastructure, as Ms. Renee continues to mention, there is no documentation on the crumbling infrastructure. there's no report to support that. We continue with our road programs, and with our road programs, the sewer lines are replaced, water lines are replaced, curbing is replaced. Is there always something that could be repaired? Absolutely. But, you know, we're not gonna go out and bond for $50 million to rip up every line in Neptune City and fix it and put new. But there are plans in place. There's capital improvement projects through the sewer department. There's capital improvement projects through Public Works that are maintenance every year. We reline pipes. Every single year there's pipes relined. We get that through our sewer director, or operator of our sewer department. And the water lines, you know, one of the biggest holdups on 3rd Avenue and Union was the reason why that project took so long was because everything under that road was replaced, and then we resurfaced it in sidewalks and stuff. So, you know, our infrastructure is not crumbling. Is there areas in Neptune City that need attention? Absolutely, as there are in every single town. So I you know, I can't just sit here. This board was criticized for the work that it's done, that there were bad things done over the past several years, improvements and projects done. Well, those projects and improvements were done by this board, and you know, I'm pretty proud of the work that this board's done with many of the projects that we've approved and done over the years. Say that.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Okay.
We'll offer a motion to adjourn.
There's been a motion to adjourn the meeting by Randy Reynolds. Anyone second? Second by Craig Morgan. All in favor?
Wait, motion.
Aye.
Aye.
We have a motion on the floor.
Yeah. Okay. There's a motion on the floor to adjourn the meeting, so.
Unless the
Can we
person,
say that one more?
we have a motion on the floor to join the meeting, there's a second. We need a roll call vote under the rules and regulations. Robert's rules.
Patricia Duran,
Yes.
Robert Brown,
Yes.
Pamela Renee,
Yes.
Robert Rounds,
Yes.
Randy Reynolds,
Yes.
John Scotto,
Yes.
Michelle Williams,
Yes.
Craig Morgan, Aaron McGrath.
Yes. Meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everyone. Where'd you see that?
I gotta slide down. I tried to skip this one, but I